YouTube, Sidekick here, and welcome to another episode of 70 Years of Moving Mud, the History of Iron Bombing podcast. This is episode 8, and in this episode, we're going to talk a lot less, actually, about moving mud. We're going to talk a lot about moving air, a lot of air, and moving it quickly, which is just my way of saying that in this episode, we're finally going to talk in detail about breaking the sound barrier and what that meant for aircraft design in the 1950s. First, though, it's worth backing up a step and going back to the end of the Korean War to understand why the obsession with the sound barrier really became the factor driving aircraft design in this period. So let's consider, in particular, what the United States, and specifically the United States Air Force, learned or thought they learned during the Korean War. So to recap the Korean War experience, which we've covered in a couple of other podcast episodes, but in summary, the experience from the U.S. perspective was this. First of all, at a strategic level, the Korean conflict convinced the United States that they really were in a life or death struggle against communism, and that the Reds were prepared to engage in armed conflict as part of that struggle. Now, you have to remember that this was also the era of McCarthyism and the Red Scare in the U.S., so the mood in the United States was very much one that Western democracies were in an existential struggle against communism. The second strategic or geopolitical lesson that the United States took away from the Korean War was that proxy fights could escalate into full-out conflict if they weren't careful, and that this really should be avoided at all cost. This arose from the very unpleasant experience of having the People's Republic of China invade, Korea in response to the UN invasion of North Korea after Incheon. Said Chinese invasion had inflicted a significant defeat on U.S. forces and was very nearly resulted in them being ejected from the peninsula entirely. So the net result of all of that was that the U.S. military policy effectively went in the direction of focusing on a strategy of, frankly, deterring any communist aggression through a principle that became known as massive retaliation, which was basically the idea that if threatened, the United States was perfectly prepared to initiate a nuclear conflict, and to do so with the first strike that would basically prevent any response. This is an important thing to recognize because it's very different than the world that we have grown up in, say, in the last certainly 30 years, maybe 40 years, where the idea was that nuclear conflict was going to be avoided through a policy of mutually assured destruction, of deterrence that anyone would start a conflict that might spiral into a nuclear war. In the 1950s, the U.S. was quite prepared to say that in response to a communist provocation that was serious enough, the United States was perfectly prepared to retaliate with a massive first nuclear strike. This strike would, of course, be delivered by the Air Force. The new wrinkle in the plan was that the nuclear weapons would not only be delivered by the bombers of Strategic Air Command, striking at the heart of the enemy. Nuclear weapons would also be delivered by the fighters of Tactical Air Command, who would pave the way for the bombers by flying in low and taking out the defenses and air bases and command and control nodes so that the bombers could arrive over their targets unmolested. In short, after Korea, the U.S. Air Force seriously doubled down on its commitment to being the war-winning arm of United States Armed Forces and to winning that war using nuclear weapons, and nuclear weapons delivered by aircraft. You have to remember this was also the period before the development of true intercontinental ballistic missiles. So nuclear bombs that were going to be delivered were going to be dropped from aircraft. Now, utterly missing from the lessons that the United States Air Force learned from Korea were any lessons about how to, or not to, use the Air Force in a limited war, and how to make effective, or not, use of their aircraft to attack targets on the ground in support of such a war. Now, the Air Force would come to regret not learning those lessons, well, or at least its pilots would. But that's not really what I want to talk about today. We will get to that in subsequent episodes, though, you can rest assured. Today, I want to talk about one of the lessons that the Air Force did take away from the Korean War, in terms of what they thought they would need to execute their mission as they saw it. Specifically, the lesson about what they would need in an aircraft that would perform that mission. And the short answer is speed. The Korean War confirmed in the minds of the U.S. Air Force and its pilots that the one thing that a modern jet fighter needed was more speed. They had seen that in their attacks on the ground, because the faster they flew, the harder it was for gunners on the ground to hit them, and also the faster they flew, the less time they gave defenses on the ground to react, even if they did have radar warning. And finally, the confrontation with the MiGs over the Yalu had convinced them once and for all that speed was life when it came to air-to-air combat, because it was pretty simple. Aircraft that had speed survived and shot down the aircraft that did not. So the United States Air Force needed faster jets. But there was a problem, well, an issue anyways, and that was that there was really no way to go faster without dealing with and eventually breaking the sound barrier, because the fastest jets in the Korean War, the F-86 and the MiG-15, were already basically flirting with the maximum speed that was possible without dealing with the issue of the sound barrier once and for all. So the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. government decided it was time to get serious about understanding how to build an aircraft that could sustain speeds in excess of the speed of sound and, also be controllable and perform other useful functions while it did that. Now, a number of authors, particularly Thomas McKelvey Creever, have pointed out just exactly how large an undertaking this actually was. Designing aircraft that could achieve and maintain speeds greater than Mach 1 required not only an immense research effort in aerodynamics, including advanced facilities the likes of which had never really been built before. It also required expensive and detailed flight test programs, which in turn required advanced aircraft to be designed and built. But beyond the aerodynamics, reliably building supersonic aircraft also required the mastery of new materials and new manufacturing techniques in order to produce the airframes, and particularly the wings, that were simultaneously immensely strong to withstand aerodynamic forces well beyond anything experienced before, but to do it with structures that were lighter than ever before, and also built into much more complex shapes than they ever had been before. In truth, the conversion to supersonic or even high transonic designs basically required inventing a whole new way of designing and building aircraft. Cleaver goes so far as to say that the post-World War II U.S., with such a huge industrial capacity and a gross domestic product that approached half of the world's total output at the time, was maybe the only country that could have pulled it off, or at least pulled it off in as short a period of time as was required. So today, as I promised for a while, I want to take a bit more of a deeper dive into, well, not just breaking the sound barrier itself, but also on how the U.S. Aircraft industry effectively turned that barrier into, well, really kind of just a speed bump. So let's talk about why the speed of sound is such a big deal in aerodynamics. I mean, everybody who knows much about airplanes knows that the speed of sound is a big deal. In fact, past a certain point in airspeed, we actually only talk about aircraft speed in relation to the speed of sound, referring to speed by Mach number rather than by miles or kilometers per hour. But why? Well, let's take a look at how air works and why the speed of sound actually matters. To understand that, let's take a look at the three states of matter. Basic high school or maybe university physics or chemistry will tell you that there are three basic states of matter. Now, physicists and chemists will take exception to that statement and point out that it's not actually that simple, but let's stick with the simple model for now. The three states of matter are, in order of organization, solid, liquid, and gas. Now, solids are very organized in that every atom in a solid basically has a fixed relationship with every other atom, and so they basically keep their shape. You can't really compress them, and you can't really make them change shape without an awful lot of effort anyways. Now, liquids and gases, on the other hand, are both fluids, meaning that the atoms in these substances are not fixed in position and can move around and flow. You can deform them easily every time you stir your coffee. In fact, you deform both the coffee with the spoon and the air around the cup with the motion of your hand. As you move the object, hand or spoon, through the fluid, the atoms or molecules in the fluid get out of the way and flow around the object. The difference between the liquid coffee and the gaseous air is something called compressibility. To put it simply, gases are compressible and liquids aren't. This basically means that the individual particles in a liquid stay more or less the same distance from one another. Effectively, the density of the liquid doesn't really change very much, and it's pretty uniform at all times. And once again, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but, stay with me. The particles in a gas, on the other hand, can get closer together or farther apart, meaning that the density of the gas can change pretty easily, which is why, in fact, heating air causes it to become less dense than the cool air around it, and so it rises. So when an airplane moves through the air at much lower than the speed of sound, the air basically gets out of the way through a combination of actually moving, but also through the process of compression and expansion. Pushing something into the air causes the nearby molecules to get out of the way, but it also causes the molecules to pile up in front of the motion and spread out evenly behind it. This makes gases much easier to move through than liquids, effectively. Now, the way that compression and expansion move through the gas is through pressure waves. In any gas, at a given temperature and pressure, there will be a characteristic speed at which the pressure waves move. Now, since sound is actually just a compression and expansion wave in air, the speed we're talking about here is in fact the speed of sound. So, what happens when you try to move something through air at faster than this speed? Well, basically it means that the molecules in front of the object can no longer send signals ahead of the object telling the other molecules to get out of the way, because the speed at which those signals are transmitted is actually slower than the motion of the object. This means that suddenly air actually becomes incompressible, meaning it starts to act more like a liquid and less like a gas, at least as far as the object that is moving in it is concerned. This very sudden transition from compressible to incompressible fluid is at the heart of all of the effects that breaking the sound barrier entails, basically. It's at this point that the fluid dynamics get really interesting, meaning extremely complicated. So I'm really going to start oversimplifying now. By the way, you should know that it is a standard joke amongst fluid dynamicists that Albert Einstein originally started out studying fluid dynamics, but switched to relativity because it was easier. Maybe you need to be a physicist to get that joke. At any rate, let's just say that the shift to incompressibility has two principal effects that have to be accounted for if you want to successfully transition to controlled supersonic flight. The first is the effect of incompressibility on drag. In other words, the force that pulls the aircraft back and makes it harder to maintain or increase speed. The second, perhaps and less well-known effect, is the impact of incompressibility on aerodynamic forces. Now, both of these effects are kind of mediated by shock waves. And by this, what is usually meant by a shock wave is an area of pretty massive density increase that moves away from and behind the area of supersonic flow. As these shock waves move out, they generate areas of massive increase in drag because, being incompressible, these volumes of air are just much harder to move aside than the air that's in its normal compressible form. We'll take a look at some of those impacts in a minute. But the other impact of the shock waves is that when they encounter a surface, like a control surface of an aircraft, they cause dramatic changes in the aerodynamic properties of that control surface, or at least they can. For one thing, they may make the control surface very difficult or even impossible to move at all. Or they may make the effect of moving the control surface almost ineffective compared to the effect of the actual shock wave itself. Or, in response to the motion of the control surface, they may exert so much force around the control surface that they warp the structure in ways that change or even reverse the effect of the control surface motion. So, for instance, a shock wave hitting an elevator may make it impossible to move the elevator, which, if you happen to be in a steep dive, will mean you can't pull out of it. Or they may make elevators or ailerons suddenly much less responsive, so that the aircraft just develops a mind of its own, where it goes where the shock waves push it, regardless of what the pilot tries to do about it. Or They may cause control reversal, where moving the control surfaces in one direction causes the aircraft to move in the opposite direction that is expected. None of these are pleasant experiences for the pilot, and many of them are potentially fatal. So learning how to avoid them became a matter of some concern for aircraft designers and pilots. In fact, the campaign to break the sound barrier in the U.S. after the war actually focused more on these issues than on the issues of drag, per se. Of course, the effort that I'm talking about is Chuck Yeager's famous breaking of the sound barrier in the X-1. The program was initially designed and set up by NACA, N-A-C-A, the National Advisory Council on Aeronautics. And coincidentally, it was set up by several of the scientists that would go on to form the nucleus of NASA and Project Mercury when NACA was converted into NASA at the end of the 1950s. Actually, if you want to know more about that whole process, you can check out my other podcast called Terranauts. I actually covered that in an episode. At any rate, NACA basically decided that to overcome the drag issues, they would simply kind of overpower them. Effectively, they specified that they wanted a rocket-powered aircraft with enough thrust so that they wouldn't really have to sweat the finer details, like having swept wings or not. And so the X-1 actually had straight wings. Now, the initial design of the X-1 was actually supposed to take off from the ground and climb to a high altitude using kind of low power before lighting the candle, so to speak, for a short run to Mach 1 plus. This design was planned before the end of the war, though, when there were no spare heavy bombers lying around loose that could be devoted to the project. By the time the X-1 flew, though, this problem had been alleviated, and there were plenty of B-29s available, so the X-1 ended up being carried aloft by the bomber and then dropped before igniting its own engines. Now, the propulsion system on the X-1 was pretty simple, partly because rocket engines are much more difficult to throttle than jet engines, and because rocket engines were not at all well understood in the 1940s. The X-1 was basically designed with 4 combustion chambers feeding a common nozzle. The pilot really had a choice of 5 power settings: off, 25%, 50%, 75%, and go time. It really was an indication that the X-1 program was designed to accomplish one goal: to determine how to get through the sound barrier in controlled flight. There was no thoughts of flying at Mach 1. It really was enough to ensure that the aircraft could transition through the sound barrier, not kill the pilot, come back through the sound barrier, and then glide to a landing. There was really no plan to do much more than that. Further proof of that is provided by the fact that actually most of the testing leading up to the supersonic flights were mainly about checking trim and controllability as Mach 1 was approached. And it's here that there were some very interesting results. Well, I'm not sure they were a discovery per se, because the findings really do seem to have been anticipated both by the NACA scientists and eventually by Yeager himself. Basically, the team seems to have figured out that the key to maintaining good control with elevators, which was a big issue, was to adjust the angle of the whole horizontal stabilizer carefully based on transonic testing. This was actually how the trim on the X-1 worked, by adjusting the whole stabilizer's angle of attack. And they found, indeed, that even small adjustments of the whole stabilizer had significant impacts on the usability of the elevator controls in the transonic and supersonic regions. And now this was a key discovery, and one that led to the conclusion that for supersonic designs, it was essential to move from the stabilizer elevator system that was normal at the time to a fully movable stabilator or flying tail design where the whole surface moved, instead of having a hinged control surface on a static stabilizer. This proved to be actually one of the most important discoveries of the whole research effort, and it's why all supersonic aircraft to this day effectively use a stabilator design. Exactly why this should be so is a bit arcane, but as I understand it, the interaction of the supersonic shockwave coming off the wing caused real issues when it hit a hinged surface, because in a sense, that hinged surface is a much more complicated situation than having a single plane that might deflect through a range of motion. And essentially, the change of shape caused by having a hinge point in the middle of the surface just caused some really unpredictable and undesirable effects. But it turned out if you used a completely moving control surface, if you put it in the flow behind the wing where it normally went, it actually worked quite well. Now, this is in contrast to the other method of solving this problem, the elevator problem, which had been tried, which was to raise the horizontal stabilizer high enough on the tail to get it out of the shock wave caused by the wing. And this actually turned out not to work nearly as well, which fact was demonstrated in practical terms when the F-86s, with a standard stabilizer arrangement, especially the later F models, proved that they were much more comfortable at high Mach numbers than the MiG-15s with a T-tail. In fact, all subsequent MiG designs would use a more standard empennage and would move to the full flying tail once it was clear that that was the secret. So, the flying tail was one of the most important innovations that allowed for controlled supersonic flight, but there were some other important findings, about wings, for instance. First of all, it became clear that swept wings, though not absolutely essential if you had enough thrust, but they were pretty critical in that they did reduce so-called wave drag caused by the supersonic shock waves, and pretty dramatically. So they really became a de facto standard in early supersonic fighter designs when you weren't simply going to bash your way through the sound barrier with a rocket engine. But it's not only important to sweep the wings, it turns out, it's also important to make them thin. As thin really as possible. Because a thick wing not only made the whole thing, less aerodynamic, it also caused other problems as Mach 1 was approached. It turned out that thicker wings had a dramatic effect on the rise of wave drag. Again, the reasons for this are a bit arcane, but effectively, it kind of makes sense. In a compressible fluid, the thickness of the wing contributed to the drag, yes, but this effect was kind of mitigated by the compressibility of the air. It was just easier for the air to get out of the way. In an incompressible fluid, the amount of space the wing took up became much more of an issue because the farther the air had to deflect to flow around the wing, the more other air had to displace for it to do that. This, in effect, is what led to the supersonic shock waves and to wave drag. And it actually gave rise to something that is known in aerodynamics as the supersonic area rule. The area rule says that in order to minimize wave drag, it's important to hold the cross-sectional area of the aircraft as constant as possible and to change it as gradually as possible. Which is why you end up with very long noses and to some extent long tail extensions on supersonic jets. Now, the area rule is easy to apply to the fuselage sections. You just keep them the same size. But what do you do when you encounter the wings? The wings naturally add a potentially large amount of cross-sectional area. And this is partly why swept wings help. The added cross-section of a swept wing is introduced much more gradually than a straight wing. It's also why thin wings help. They just add less cross-section. But it's also why fighter designs feature fuselages that change shape over the wing. In the early designs, this led to the Coke bottle effect that is so prominent on the F-5, for instance. In modern fighters, the effect is achieved more by thinning the fuselage vertically, sort of flattening it. Think of designs like modern Russian fighters particularly. Either way, the thinner the wing, the easier it was to design an aircraft that minimized wave drag. There was a problem, though. The other finding, with respect to wings, was that they needed to be very stiff, and especially stiff right out at the wingtips, because the problem was the ailerons. See, putting a control surface out of the edge of the wing in supersonic flow subjected that area of the wing around the aileron to enormous forces, and these forces could cause the whole wing to deform when the ailerons deflected. And this is what in turn could cause the effect of control reversal, as the deformation of the wing could actually cause it to act as if the aileron had been deflected in the other direction. So it really was important to have stiff, thin, swept wings. Now, this is easy to say, but actually a significant challenge for a mechanical engineer. In fact, it was only barely possible using the metallurgy and construction techniques available in 1950, and then it was only possible using very careful, time-consuming, and expensive machining and construction techniques. These techniques were not at all suited to mass production in any way. A few aircraft could be built this way, but not enough to equip an entire Air Force, at least not cost effectively. So this is why the supersonic revolution was not really only about the science of fluid mechanics, it was also about the engineering of industrial machining and manufacturing processes. The transition to making supersonic aircraft effectively required the retooling and retraining of that part of the U.S. aircraft industry that wanted to make those kinds of aircraft. The new machines and the new processes were expensive to develop and much more expensive than flight testing had actually been. And this is why Thomas McKelvey Cleaver insists that the supersonic revolution really came about because of the confluence of scientific understanding of the problem, along with a country and an industry that had sufficient spare capacity and affluence to assimilate the necessary revolution in manufacturing. And assimilate them it did. In the course of a decade, from 1950, the U.S. fighter industry went from having produced exactly no supersonic aircraft, or one if you count the X-1, to producing literally thousands of them. And in effect, Mach 1 went from being a sound barrier to effectively being the price of admission for a modern jet fighter design. In 1947, it was a genuine question whether or not a fighter pilot could survive the transition to supersonic speed. By 1960, it was basically assumed that if a fighter pilot wanted to survive in combat, he would have to cross this boundary without really thinking about it. That change in thinking was pretty profound in terms of aircraft design. When those design changes were combined with the emerging doctrine about how that speed should be used that we talked about earlier, the effects were kind of dramatic. And while it produced some of the most iconic aircraft designs of all time, it can't be said that those designs were particularly well suited to performing missions focused on supporting troops on the ground. They were pretty, they were fast, and they were marvels of modern technology. They were not, by any means, excellent movers of mud, although many of them would end up doing that job for a living. But, that's a story that we should continue next time, in the next episode of this podcast. So in that episode, next, we'll take a look at the designs that came out of the need for speed and the new U.S. Air Force doctrine, and where that took us through the decade of the 1950s. So tune in next time for 70 Years of Moving Mud, the History of Iron Bombing podcast, where we'll talk about that. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk again soon.